So, the October Revolution. Lenin, as was his wont, pretty militantly looked at the situation and decided that the Kornilov affair had left all of the other main groups in Russia in too weak of a position to really stop the Bolshevik takeover of power. The other Bolsheviks weren't sure about this, especially guys like Kamenev and Zinoviev, who will meet in the next unit, when Stalin executes them. They argued that other socialist parties would not agree with this, that there would be a civil war, and that the Bolsheviks would be isolated and they'd lose. Lenin just rode over these disagreements, democratic centralism, if you remember. And Trotsky, although he wasn't entirely opposed, Trotsky had the clever idea to push back the Bolshevik seizure of power until there was a gathering of representatives from all the Soviets throughout the country, and that would be on the 25th of October 1917. Kerensky got word of these plans and started trying to crack down on the Bolsheviks more, trying to arrest their leaders, closing their presses, subduing what was known as the Red Guard, which were paramilitary units, armed supporters of the Bolsheviks that were trained by them and had access to the weapons of the Russian army, because the Petrograd Soviet was actually in charge. It had claimed responsibility for all of the weapons that the army had. Kerensky also tried to actually physically isolate the Bolshevik supporters by drawing up the bridges throughout Petrograd. Petrograd, as you may or may not know, is called the Venice of the North because it's a city of rivers and canals. But this plan didn't. Kerensky once again was a little too late with the plan, and so really all it did was give the Bolsheviks a reason to claim that it was Kerensky who was trying to seize power, and the Bolsheviks were only trying to stop him. So on the night of October 24th to 25th, the Bolsheviks just basically, silently, more or less bloodlessly, just replaced all of the people guarding the key areas in Petrograd, your strategic points like bridges, telephone exchanges, power stations, and so on. And the people who woke up on the morning of the 25th, the next day in Petrograd, didn't even notice anything. Nothing by appearances had really changed. But that was only one part of it. The next night, the Bolsheviks, obviously the Provisional Government, had noticed. They weren't your everyday citizens. So the Provisional Government was kind of, what was left of it anyway, was holed up in the Winter Palace. And the Bolsheviks stormed it the night of the 25th to the 26th and just arrested all the other leaders who were there. And the storming of the Winter Palace has became kind of a really key part in the Bolshevik mythology. Oh, the great heroic, the heroic storming of the palace against artillery and against the elements and so on and so on. It's not really the case. The picture you see right here is from the Sergei Eisenstein movie, which came out years later, 10 Days That Shook the World. And I think the old story is that more people were actually injured in the recreation of the storming of the Winter Palace for this movie than were actually injured during the real storming of the Winter Palace. So kind of not... the October Revolution wasn't really much of a fight. It wasn't a true revolution in the sense of the uprising of the people. It was more a coup, you could say, one kind of a military replacement of a regime. And so the counterpoint of this kind of, I guess, masked military uprising was the political aspect of this. And so at the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, Lenin and Trotsky were trying to persuade all of the other socialist parties, especially the Mensheviks and the SRs, to join the Bolsheviks in this in their takeover, in their kind of displacement of the provisional government. And this is where Trotsky famously condemned anyone who opposed him to the dustbin of history, which is actually a really good insult to toss at people who kind of try to stop your plans. But this was not very successful. The other groups, the other socialist groups, rejected this. They still thought that there would need to be, as per Marx, a period of democratic bourgeois capitalist government to pave the way for socialism. And so the other parties walked out, thus once again giving Lenin all he needed to accurately say that the majority of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets voted with him. And really, in Petrograd anyway, there wasn't much bloodshed after that. There was some bloodshed in other cities. Moscow needed a lot of, for about 10 days, Moscow was a battleground between provisional government forces and Bolshevik forces. But in the end, it went with the Bolsheviks. Other cities followed in not too long. However, this left the Bolsheviks with control not of the entire country, not of the entire kind of governmental system of organizations and institutes. A lot of the Soviets, for instance, were still in control of the other socialist parties and were not willing to go quietly to agree to this Bolshevik takeover. Especially in the villages, especially in rural areas where the SRs were much more powerful, and the Bolsheviks were almost non-existent. Other civil servants, the middle class of Petrograd, the bureaucrats, also rejected the Bolshevik takeover. When Trotsky showed up the next day on, it would have been October 26th, showed up at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and announced that he was their new boss, and they laughed at him. He eventually came back, as Trotsky does, with guns and that kind of thing, and they stopped laughing. But that type of thing happened again and again. The state bank refused to provide the Bolsheviks with access to the vault. So the Bolsheviks can't pay their supporters. They can't run the government without that money. Eventually, you can kind of guess what happened, and it involved the Bolsheviks getting that money. But in the beginning, the Bolsheviks were very weak. They established a new governing body that sidestepped the Soviet, which is kind of ironic considering that one of the slogans they rode to victory was "All power to the Soviets." But the Sovnarkom, which is the Russians and the communists especially, love these kind of I'm not sure what the word would be aside from acronyms, but constructonyms you can call them. The Sovnarkom was basically a Bolshevik-only body, and its early decrees were a mix of things that, to a modern, say, American observer, might look like kind of good ideas, like, oh, good, no child labor. Okay, an 8-hour day. That sounds like a pretty fine idea. A certain level of social welfare spending, that kind of thing, a healthcare system. All these things were some of the early decrees of the Sovnarkom. But other things reflected either a very progressive, especially for the time, or liberal sense of social issues. Things like divorce were legalized and abortion. There was the official granting of gender equality, and gender equality is one of those things that is incredibly, one of the great achievements of the law in the future Soviet Union, but not exactly something that happened in reality. And the church was also pushed out of the legal sphere in a lot of ways. Church land was taken away. The Russian Orthodox Church was removed from involvement in marriages and that kind of thing. Other steps that the Bolsheviks took were involved banning the opposition, democratizing the army, so getting rid of ranks and having officers be elected, and getting rid of all the kind of formalities involved with salutes and titles and that kind of thing. And there were other things that the Sovnarkom did that in some ways were were basically just recognitions that the Bolsheviks had no power to enforce anything except what was already going on. And this included the granting of self-determination to national minorities, because the Bolsheviks were just not in a position to exert their will over, say, Poles or Finns or a lot of the Baltic area, in the areas in the Caucasus or in the Ukraine. There was the granting of control of finance and production to factory workers, which, once again, the factory workers were taking matters into their own hands. So this, the Bolsheviks rightly recognized that since they don't have the power to stop this, they might as well get on the side of it that's actually happening, so they can kind of try to take some credit for it, at least among the workers. And a similar thing happened among the peasants, who were seizing land left and right, and had been for quite some time. So that in a lot of ways, what look like really radical steps by the Sovnarkom are actually signs of weakness, and the Bolsheviks' recognition that they didn't have the power to stop what was happening throughout the country. Next, the opposition. The Constituent Assembly, which was elected, I believe, in November of 1917, after the Bolsheviks took power. But the Bolsheviks, having once again constantly criticized Kerensky for delaying the elections to the Constituent Assembly, which would decide Russia's future form of government, the Bolsheviks couldn't really keep delaying these elections. But the problem was, the Bolsheviks, in the grand scheme of things, won only a small minority of seats in the Constituent Assembly. So, what are you going to do? Well, if you're Lenin, you're going to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. Lenin claimed that Soviet forms of government were more advanced than mere democratically elected assemblies, and so he let the assembly meet for one day, and then he shut it down. And when a crowd of people appeared to protest this, the Red Army, or that is the Red Guard, fired upon them. So, kind of getting off to an early start, replicating the oppressive behavior of the Tsarist government. After that, the leading members of other parties, starting with the Cadets, who were, if you remember, the liberal group, and then even Mensheviks and SRs, who were other socialists, but not necessarily as radical as the Bolsheviks. They were arrested. They were roughed up. Sometimes they were actually killed by overzealous Bolsheviks. The legal system was abolished. That you had basically citizens taking, or the most radical elements of the citizenry, taking justice into their own hands, figuring out, based, say, on what somebody was wearing, whether or not they were what's called bourgeois, which became the kind of all-use insult during this time period. If you call someone a bourgeois, which means bourgeois, then basically they are liable to be arrested or beaten, to potentially even killed by a mob in the streets, or that kind of thing. There was a huge element of lawlessness during this time period, and kind of drunken, violent rampages were very common, especially by the former kind of oppressed elements, or just economically downtrodden elements that would just run rampant in the more well-off districts of Petrograd or other big cities. In terms of organization, the Bolsheviks created the Cheka, which was the new secret police force, quite a bit more efficient and effective than the Tsar's old Okhrana. And the Cheka basically began a campaign of terror against suspected class enemies. Anybody who may have been secretly supporting the old regime, or who was counter-revolutionary, meaning trying to bring back either the Provisional Government or, worst of all, the Tsar. And we'll be talking about the Cheka more in the future. It'll eventually morph into a series of different, differently named groups that all basically preserve the same function or perform the same function of being the regime's secret police. And one of the most important steps that the new Bolshevik government took was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. We've already talked about this a decent amount in a previous unit. It was a really horrible treaty for Russia. Russia had to give away most of its Baltic areas, most of Poland, some of Belarus, Ukraine. A lot of the Caucasus was given kind of semi-autonomy. And this had huge amounts of Russia's population, more than half of Russia's industry, of the most productive fields in terms of creating food, all of these things that undercut the government right when it was most kind of up against the wall. In part, then, this represents Lenin's realization that the rest of the capitalist world is not quite ready to rise up in rebellion. Lenin was actually trying to draw out negotiations with the German government to some extent to give revolutionary elements in Germany time to revolt against the Kaiser. But that decision ended up not really working. And as we know, since Russia's army was basically disintegrating, this was good for the Bolsheviks because it meant that Kerensky had nothing to stop them with. But it was also bad for the Bolsheviks because it meant that there was nothing to stop the Germans. And the Germans just swept on through the western part of Russia, just kind of gobbling up resources as they went. So in the end, the treaty was probably necessary for the Bolsheviks, but it had the other effect of uniting many disparate groups throughout the empire that were not very interested in seeing such a huge amount of their land to be given away to their archenemies. So this really helped bring together the rightist forces that would go on to fight the civil war against Russia. That is against the Bolsheviks. And it also created divisions within the Bolsheviks or even the left SRs because they expected the fight against Germany to continue on into Berlin, where they would be greeted by Red Brigades from Germany itself, and the revolution would become international. So in a couple of ways, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk basically sped Russia forward to its civil war.